later. There we go. All right. So my name is Larissa Phillips, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Reading Science. I'm a recent graduate of the doctoral program as well. And prior to coming to MSJ, I spent 18 years in public education, working as an intervention specialist, a reading specialist, and co-teaching in kindergarten through third grade classrooms. So this is a topic that I really didn't spend a lot of my career diving into because most of the time I was helping students with word recognition skills. So diving into the vocabulary, language comprehension, reading comprehension is newer learning for me in this last 5 to 6 years. So this is exciting to get to share this with you tonight. So text-dependent questions are questions that require students to return to the text itself for evidence and reasoning. And these questions cannot be answered from prior knowledge or personal opinion. They demand close reading and attention to what the author actually says. When we ask text-dependent questions, we are teaching students that meaning lives in the words and structure of the text. To answer well, they must read carefully, cite evidence, and think critically about how details support ideas. Sorry, my slides are a little off there. So looking at these two questions, I want you to think about which one of these would be a text-dependent question. And the reason why we want students to really stay in connection with those text-dependent questions is because departing from the text removes students' cognition from the text message, and it reduces that comprehension and the concentration. Departing from the text in classroom discussions privileges those who already have experience about the topic, and we know it's easier to talk about our experiences than analyze the text. So just showing me on your fingers 1 or 2, which one of these is the example of a text-dependent question? Good. I see lots of ones. That's right. Question 1 is the text-dependent question. What were the major goals of the United Nations as outlined in the UN preamble? We can tell from without reading the text that that is the one that would rely on the text to be able to answer. It's going to take students' attention, their cognition back to the text to be able to answer that question. All right, so looking here, we have a nice graph visual here that shows the progression of text-dependent questions. According to Fry and Fisher, effective comprehension instruction follows a whole-to-part progression when developing text-dependent questions. Rather than beginning with isolated details or vocabulary, teachers first guide students to grasp the big picture or the overall meaning, structure, and purpose of the text. This helps establish a mental framework so that students can later analyze smaller components in a meaningful context. Instruction begins by asking those whole questions that address the text's key ideas, themes, and structure. For example, students might be asked, what is the text mostly about? Or why did the author write this piece? These overarching questions promote comprehension of the text's purpose and message. Once students have that understanding of the text as a whole, instruction can move to part questions, which require that closer analysis of smaller segments, maybe a specific paragraph, maybe even at the sentence level, word choices, or textual features. And these questions might focus on how the author's language, evidence, or structure contributes to the overall meaning. For example, what does the author mean by this phrase? Or how does this paragraph help develop the main idea? By zooming in on those key details after building that global understanding, students are more likely to make those connections between parts and the whole.
Oh, there's Sean. Oh my God.
So Fry and Fisher emphasize that this progression mirrors how expert readers make meaning. They first construct an overall sense of the text before interrogating its details. Beginning with the whole also helps students sustain comprehension, avoid getting lost in minutia, and they can see how details serve a larger purpose. We can support this questioning sequence intentionally, moving from general to specific, surface to deep, and whole to part, scaffold with both of those literal and inferential understandings. And then ultimately, this approach supports close reading that is purposeful, coherent, and cognitively engaging, leading students toward independent analysis and synthesis of complex texts, which is really what we want all students to be able to do, right? That's the end goal, is for them to have that skilled reading, that analysis of complex texts. So here's a chart that shares a little bit more about that progression of text-dependent questions. So some example question stems might be when looking at the whole, and remember that focus is those central ideas, the purpose, the structure, the tone, and we want to really establish that overall understanding of the text. Here are some questions we might ask. What is this text mostly about? Why did the author write this piece? What type of text is this? Is it narrative? Is it informational or argumentative? And then what's the author's main claim or message? How is it organized? What's the mood or the tone of the text? The next chart here shows if we were to zoom in a little bit more after the students have that global understanding and maybe start to examine smaller sections. So those vocabulary, words, sentences, phrases, even paragraphs. We're looking at evidence, craft, and structure here as well. We might ask, what does the author mean by this word or phrase? Or what is the function of this paragraph in the text? How does this sentence connect to the idea before it? What is the author trying to show through this example or detail? And you can see there's a few other question examples listed there. After really looking through these charts and thinking about this is something that when I'm working with my own child, I can really see that if they don't have that global understanding of the text, moving into or this zooming in on some of these part questions can be really difficult for students if they don't have that larger, bigger grasp, bigger understanding, or that global understanding of the text. Has anybody else had that experience as well with students? Yeah. And then finally, that end stage is that synthesis. Maybe we return to the whole after we've grasped that global understanding. We've looked at some parts or some words of the text. Now we want to zoom back out and integrate understanding and evaluate the meaning. So this might bring connections across the text or other texts that students have read, themes, have implications, or even be looking at the author's craft when they were writing that text. So here are some sample question stems that we might ask students at this stage. How do the parts of the text work together to build meaning? How has your understanding of the main idea changed as you reread and analyzed details? And so on. Fry and Fisher stress that those text-dependent questions should unfold like a funnel. So starting broad to orient students, then narrowing towards specific evidence, language, and structural features, and then finally widening their lens again to synthesize what they've learned and construct meaning. Teachers can use this structure to design discussion sequences, comprehension checks, and close reading routines that promote that deeper analysis without overwhelming students. So now, having this kind of whole part model in mind, we're going to take a deeper dive into some questions or the structure of questions that we often ask students and start to think about how we can create better questions. Because what we want is to keep students in the text. We want students to make sure they've actually read the text and then rely on that text with that concentration, with that attention to text, with that cognition to be able to answer questions around the text. So thinking about how can we reframe questions as why to make them more powerful. So this prompts students to move beyond that surface level recall toward deeper reasoning and evidence-based thinking. When students are asked why, they are required to justify or explain their answers using information from the text, not just repeat facts or opinions. Fry and Fisher say that why questions push readers to connect ideas, infer author's purpose, and consider cause and effect relationships within a text, all of which build the comprehension and analytical skills we want students to have. So for example, instead of asking, what did the character do, which only requires a recall, a teacher might ask, why did the character do that? That subtle shift requires students to think about motivation, context, and textual evidence. Similarly, asking, why did the author choose this word, helps students analyze craft and structure rather than merely defining a vocabulary word. These questions also foster metacognition. We get students thinking about their thinking and making their reasoning visible, which is something we don't always see when we're asking those simple recall questions. Those why questions also support equitable classroom discussion because they invite multiple evidence-based responses rather than a single right answer. Students are asked to return to the text, cite proof, articulate reasoning, which strengthens argumentation and comprehension simultaneously. Over time, this habit of explanation develops more independent readers and thinkers who naturally ask why as they read, which really mirrors what expert readers do when they approach complex text. Staying along this line of creating better questions, we can also reframe questions using comparison. You'll see some examples here on the chart. When we ask students to make comparisons between characters, settings, events, ideas, or even text, it strengthens their comprehension by prompting deeper analysis of relationships, patterns, and contrasts. According to Fry and Fisher, comparison questions help students see how meaning is constructed across parts of a text rather than in isolation. When students compare, they must identify similarities and differences, recognize cause and effect relationships, and evaluate how the author develops ideas. This process requires higher order thinking because students must integrate information, make connections, and draw conclusions supported by that textual evidence. Comparison questions also help students notice authors' craft and structure. For instance, how is this character's response to a challenge different from another author's? Or how is this paragraph organized differently from the one before it? This encourages students to analyze their choices, their effects on meaning. In informational texts, comparing ideas, examples, or arguments helps students understand multiple perspectives and determine which evidence might be the strongest. Also, comparison questions naturally scaffold critical thinking and synthesis. If you think about those upper levels of the Bloom's taxonomy, it's really what those comparison questions are going to target. It prompts readers to connect new information to what they already know or what they've read, and then build coherence across texts and lessons. This practice develops flexible, strategic readers who can transfer comprehension strategies across contexts. By reframing those questions to require comparison, teachers can really transform reading from passive recognition into active reasoning, helping students construct rather than merely recall meaning. Finally, creating better questions reframed as statement, agree, disagree, or why and why not. So reframing these questions transforms passive comprehension checks into active reasoning opportunities. Instead of simply recalling information, students must take a position, they have to justify it with evidence, and then evaluate the accuracy or logic of a claim that they're making. This type of question really encourages that productive struggle and those good, rich conversations with students. And they really have to weigh multiple pieces of information or textual evidence, and they have to consider the author's intent and then be able to really articulate their thinking. The focus shifts from finding a single right answer to constructing a supported response. For example, instead of asking, "What is the main idea?" a teacher might say, "Agree or disagree. The main idea is that the character learned to be brave." So that reframing right there requires students to revisit the text, decide their stance, and then cite evidence to support it. It also encourages that peer discussion as students naturally compare reasoning and evidence. This process also mirrors disciplinary literacy practices, reading, interpreting, defending claims, just like historians, scientists, or literary critics do. Agree and disagree prompts also foster metacognition and critical reading. It nudges students to examine assumptions, detect bias, and evaluate statements rather than just accepting them at face value. This all builds deeper comprehension, argumentation skills, and respectful academic discourse. In short, reframing those agree disagree statements shifts students from answering questions to defending ideas with evidence, which we know is a hallmark of expert reading and thinking. All right, I hope you enjoyed those examples on those last three slides here. I thought those were really great charts and a great example of where these are a lot of those common questions. Those are questions we see in our resources and then reframed. So some of you might have seen my message today, and if you didn't, that's totally fine. But I would love some conversation tonight around what questions are you asking students? Maybe you brought your resource with you, or you know some of the questions you asked today in your classroom. How is your resource asking comprehension questions? And then, are there ways we can make them better? Did anyone bring any of a curricular resource they have maybe that has some examples of questions that are asked?
I didn't, but I'm trying to get our digital tool pulled up. I don't teach anymore. I'm a literacy coach.
Okay.
but I'm going to try to get our digital. We use Wit and Wisdom at 3.5. So I thought
Oh,
I would
great.
just try to grab something from there real quick.
That would be wonderful. I certainly noticed that those questions on the last three charts here, I'll flip back to them. Um, I really see myself when I was teaching, when I did not have a resource that I was teaching from, or if I was asking questions on the fly and I hadn't really pre-planned them, those are the types of questions I was asking students, right? Those more simple recall type questions, often digging right into the nitty gritty minutia versus making sure students have that global understanding of the text first. So, kind of two things. I wasn't really thinking about that progression from whole to part. And I also wasn't really thinking about creating better questions that kept students in the text. So I am definitely guilty of this. And certainly when I have not been prepared for a lesson or really haven't thought questions out ahead of time, I am definitely guilty of asking those more simple, those basic recall questions that students can kind of just give quickly, right? It didn't really require them to go back in the text, really didn't require any analysis or dialogue or thinking. Um, didn't really even ask them to cite information from the text. And now that we do have a lot of great curriculum on the market, um, I'm curious to see how do these curricular resources stack up when we think about this whole to part and original versus the reframing with maybe reframing with why, reframing with comparison, and finally reframing with agree or disagree. So yeah, I'm so glad Becky is going to try to find some questions and we'll see how some of these resources stack up. Anyone else, feel free to unmute and tell us about what your experiences are with asking students questions. Maybe if you're already using this strategy to reframe questions for deeper analysis, what have you seen from your students over time?
Larissa, I happen to have one of Measured Mom's decodable books by Anna
Oh,
Geiger, and
yeah.
she includes some comprehension questions in the back of one of these that I happen to have in my car with me. And
Oh,
one is so she asks, what problem does Pam have? This is a little decodable about a bear named Pam who is sick. Why do you think the dog comes to sit with Pam? What helps Pam feel better? And when you are sick, what helps you feel better? Those are some comprehension questions she included for this little decodable book.
nice. What was that first question you read?
What problem does Pam have?
Mm. So that one really does, I feel like get at like more that global understanding, right?
Right.
Is that the first one that's asked of the student?
Yep, that's the
Mhm.
first one. And Pam in the story is sick, so that's her problem. And I like the why question. Why do you think the dog comes to sit with Pam?
Mhm.
And I like too that she kind of asked that connecting question, what when you are sick, what helps you feel better?
Yeah. It's kind of zooming back out into that synthesis, right? Or making connections across texts or contexts.
Right.
Yeah. So even within a decodable, we can see that progression of whole part. Got that why question in there. There is a simple recall question in there, right?
Um, yeah. Yeah, the what problem does Pam have? That would
Mm,
probably be a recall, right? Like recalling that
yeah.
she's sick. What helps Pam feel
Mhm.
better? In the story, she takes a nap, which is what helps her feel better.
Yep.
And I guess I could mention the dog too, that the dog comes and sits with her.
Does anyone else have experience with um, teaching language comprehension? Maybe having to ask students questions? What are some of the, challenges you have in keeping students in the text?
Hey, Larissa, I am a former teacher. I'm a school psychologist now, and I taught a long time at like the 4, 5, 6 band, and then I did title for a while. And I love the agree disagree. It takes me
Mhm.
back to there was a strategy that we used to use across our science and social studies curriculums that would pose almost like a pretest first, where
Mhm.
students would, like, you would go into your text and pull some of those things out of it that you wanted them to get for big picture. And then you would do the agree, disagree. And then as they were reading, they had to prove it. So it just made me really think about not just ELA curriculums, but how can we take this and stretch it across the various subjects that we teach?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not just in our language arts classes where we need to be thinking about our questioning strategies or how we're keeping students focused on that text, right? Their cognition and their attention. Anita Archer always says we have to keep students in the text. Does anybody ever saying they're in the text, not out of the text? In the text, not out of the text. She'll make you repeat it again and again and again. And it's so critical across content areas as well. So these questioning strategies are really something, yeah, whether you're in a language arts classroom, a science, social studies classroom, even math, you can see on these slides, there's some great math examples too. Thank you for sharing that, Shelley. It's great. I think I
Okay, I could
agree,
not
disagree with that
find,
too.
oh,
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead.
I cannot find, well, my Wit and Wisdom login code expired because I have a demo
Oh.
account. So, but I did pull up our K2 curriculum, which we use Open Court,
Mm-hmm,
which has been around a long time. So I was kind of
mm-hmm.
clicking through some of the slides, and I'm just going to read some of the questions that are on an assessment at the end of one of the week-long units. So let's see here. The question number one says the following question has two parts. First, answer part A, then part B. So, part A is what is the journal describing? So, they read a story called Victor's Journal, and then they have choices. And then part B says, which sentence best supports your answer in part A? So, to me, like I was a fifth grade special education teacher. That
Mm-hmm.
reminds me a lot of like a state test. You're answering part A and then you're finding evidence in the text. So those are multiple choice questions. Another one is which of these statements about the journal is true? So that would be just a recall, I guess. They could go
Yeah.
back to the text. Which
Mm-hmm.
of these statements is an opinion? Then they've got a few short answers. Why is the town building a new school? So I feel like they would have to go back to the text and find evidence. We've been really trying hard because our schools are arranged into K2 in one school building and then 3-5. So that transition from second to third grade is really hard. And we've had a lot of conversations between the second and third grade teachers as to how to bridge the gap. And
Yeah.
I feel like what you've been talking about is as far as the comprehension goes, would be helpful to mirror questions, the same between second and third grade, because they do switch curricular materials too. They go from open court to wit and wisdom.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and if we could
so
really like almost annotate with our resources, right, to make sure we're asking those high quality questions that keep students in the text. So when students move from first and second on to third and fourth grade, and everyone's really using a similar strategy, that could be really helpful to build some consistency. Yeah. I love that thought. I think too, we are always reading ahead, looking at our lessons. And this is not necessarily a part of the lesson that I've ever thought editing or changing myself. And then after really looking at this and going through this PD that I went through, gosh, I would be annotating my questions now and thinking, is this a text dependent question? If it's a simple recall question that I know students are just going to be able to give, wouldn't I rather maybe reframe that question and annotate there in my resource? Like, how could I ask this in a better way, in a stronger way, to keep students in the text, or make sure that it requires that they read the text? I know sometimes, you see little passages, and all with good intentions, right? But sometimes you don't even have to read the text to be able to answer the questions, because they're pretty intuitive, like almost without even reading the text what the answer is going to be. So I love kind of like flipping that script and thinking about what are the questions that we are going to ask, and are they keeping students in the text? Are they keeping their cognition, their attention? Are we getting them to think about their thinking? Because we know comprehension is not necessarily something we can teach. It depends on a student's vocabulary, their background knowledge, their reading ability to lift those words off the page. Like, all of those things have to be in place for a student to be a skilled reader. And even then, we still need their concentration and their cognition on the text. So over time, how can we really make sure that we're doing that, and we're keeping students' attention in the text and getting them to cite and analyze? And I love that a lot of these questions, they really do lend themselves to opportunities for students to talk to one another, maybe a partner, a small group. You could really have students, have some really valuable conversations around the text that they're reading with these different questions. I love this one about Ben Franklin. Agree, disagree. Ben Franklin was a great American, right? Versus, why is Ben Franklin considered a great American?
I have some example questions
Oh, lovely, Lisa.
from
Thank you.
American Reading Company. We just adopted ARC this year, and we actually
Okay.
had piloted Wit and Wisdom,
Okay.
which I really liked Wit and Wisdom.
Okay.
But ARC does a really great job of offering high level questions. We just completed our first novel study, and it gives basic comprehension, reader's response, and vocabulary questions. So the examples of this particular day: what happened in this chapter? How do you know? And then what is surprising, funny, confusing, and why? And then what vocabulary words have you noticed? What might they mean, and how do you know?
Mm.
And it provides those for every day that we read text.
Okay. Yeah. That first one made me think about that main idea question that I gave it as an example. Like, what was this chapter mostly about? That makes me think about one of the examples that I gave. Trying to think if it was on this slide or previous slide. Maybe not. It's a main idea example. You think did students have trouble coming up with vocabulary words?
Sometimes, um, sometimes they did, but if we partnered them in the
Mm-hmm.
right way, they were able to get deeper into it.
Okay, yeah, that's a good strategy. Partnering just gives students that safe space to like maybe explore and share an idea that they wouldn't want to share with the whole group. They can share in that little close partnership and kind of try out some of their ideas first before sharing with the whole group. I love students working in partners when they can, when it's appropriate.
Dr. Phillips, there is a question in the chat. I don't know
Oh,
if you want
thank
to
you.
check it.
Oh, thank you. Mhm. Okay. Okay. I did see an early on. Yes, I will share these with you in an email with the recording. Um, Somebody said, how does the setting affect the characters and speakers in the text? What are your thoughts on sequencing questions? Sequencing steps or sequencing events? Are they as effective? What about questions that get students to identify particular vocabulary words within the text? What does everyone think about the sequencing? What are your thoughts on sequencing questions? Sequencing steps or sequencing events? I My opinion is that I really think that's a good recall activity to see if students really understood the different parts of a story. Part of that global understanding, right? If we're thinking of that whole to part progression, I think that those types of questions um, really help with that.
I think they also help with transitioning into writing. So it helps them
Hmm.
see how authors sequence things and why. Um,
Yes,
give them
that's a
ideas
great
of how
point.
they can write.
That's a great point, Lisa. Yeah. The text structure so that students can really see how did the author tell this story or how did the author order this information. And then as students really become the writers, they can really use that craft and structure in their own writing. Most narrative text is that similar beginning, middle, and end, but then we have different text structures when it comes to um, informational text. So really pointing out those differences and, sequencing questions or those steps could help students really see the differences there. I do think it is hard for students to identify particular vocabulary words within a text. And I think about how I want to approach vocabulary, and I know that I want to choose words strategically that students are really going to get high utility from. I know that I'm going to want to pre plan some explicit instruction around vocabulary. So I definitely think it's great for students to be able to identify words that they don't understand or words that really trip them up. But as far as just kind of leaving vocabulary to students to identify, I'm going to want to really take that next step and be a little bit more strategic with my vocabulary. Does anybody have any other thoughts on that? Should we have students read questions before reading the text? That help them be more focused in reading, or could that be distracting them from understanding the text as a whole? That's a great question. I don't know that my answer is, based off of any research that I know of when I answer this. I have found, as far as getting students to read with intention, that setting them up with maybe a question or an idea before reading can really help promote some of that cognition and thinking, and to help students really go into that text knowing that they are, remember, you're reading for meaning here. We're going to read to find out. I often do that too to help generate excitement about a text. So I want you to be thinking about why the character does what he does, or why this happens. And we're going to come back together at the end and talk about it, so that students, really start off that text reading with some intention, um, and knowing that they're going to be held accountable for the information that they read. So I don't know that that's based off of the research, but that's what I'm going to say right now. But I'm happy to follow up on that as well. Does anybody have different experience with that? Having students look at questions or read the questions before reading the text? These are great questions. This one question here, somebody put in the chat: how does the setting affect the characters and speakers in the text? So I wonder if we could practice reframing that as why. Would anyone want to drop an idea in the chat on how we could reframe that question? How does the setting affect the characters and speakers in the text? Um, yes. Evelyn said, um, my experience is that some students simply look for similar words in question stems and text and then zoom in on that to answer, not sure if they're actually reading for full understanding. Yeah, I've had that same experience. They kind of just maybe hear a word in the question, right? And then zoom in on a part of the text where they read that word or heard that word and are just looking for something to maybe grab onto. Oh, I love that. Why does the setting cause Brian to use survival skills in chapter 6? That's great, Becky. I love that. Somebody said, how do we help students who can answer comprehension questions correctly, but have difficulty answering the same questions in writing? So they can answer them orally, I'm guessing, but they have problems answering them in writing. It could be going from the, if they're using more of that informal conversational speech as they answer questions, and then when they go to write, they're trying to maybe record them in a more formal way, and they don't have the language or the writing skills for that. Absolutely, the spelling, the processing, the grammar can really, if they're not strong in all of those areas, that's where we really see thinking come to life, and we can really see what students are saying and thinking is in their writing. And it really requires a lot of skills. It requires a lot of things happening at once to get that on paper. So it could definitely be a breakdown in any or many of those areas. Begin with some basic answer stems as models first, then gradually drop the scaffold. Absolutely. I love that. I love providing students with a sentence stem. I just saw this in a third grade classroom today, done really well. Students had finished reading a passage, were asked to answer this question, cite evidence, and then after the discussion happened, they were provided with a sentence stem to then write in response to that question. Right. Okay, well, we are almost at an end time here. If there, please feel free, drop any other questions in the chat. Also, again, very informal. Feel free to unmute and share your experiences or your maybe tips and tricks for working with students.
I was just going to say how great I think this has been to really help reframe how, things look in the classroom to help students really get that greater meaning out of it. And thinking about some of the writing stuff, I can't help but think about strategies that reduce that cognitive load for students.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times they're trying to remember so many things if they're trying to spell correctly, and what did I want to write, and where's the punctuation, and how do I capitalize. So just those high leverage strategies for working memory can sometimes help with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we know that students only have a really small space in that working memory, right? So they're trying to do all of those things at once. That can be really hard. Really hard. Just a quick check-in, just a little fun little activity here to round it out. Agree or disagree? Text-dependent questions can only be answered by referring directly to evidence in the text or content presented. Agree or disagree? Agree? And that rationale is that, yeah, those students require students to return to the text, find information, and use them to support their answers. And our goal is to really build those good habits of citing evidence and reading closely. Oh, the second one, sorry, the text is messed up on that one. Text-dependent questions encourage students to rely on their background knowledge and personal experiences to answer. Agree or disagree? Yep, disagree. And that's false, because while background information knowledge really does support comprehension, we know that text-dependent questions focus on what the author actually says or shows us. So answers should come from textual evidence, not from opinion or experience. The third one, When students answer text-dependent questions, they must read carefully and use specific words or details from the text to support their answer and their thinking. And that one is agree. These questions promote that close reading, require students to quote, maybe paraphrase or summarize information that is directly from the text to justify their answers. And the last one, text-dependent questions can be used with both literary and informational text to deepen comprehension and discussion. Yes. Yep, it's not just for one or the other. Those text-dependent questions apply across genres. So whether you're analyzing a story, an article, students can strengthen their comprehension by grounding their responses in that textual evidence. Okay. All right, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I know you are probably all tired after a long day of teaching or working in schools, classrooms, really across the country and even joining us from the Philippines tonight. So it's so nice of you to be here. I thank you for being here, and I will share the recording and the slides with you, and you are welcome to use them with your colleagues and disseminate and share with your friends. So thank you for being here. Oh, thank you, Shelley. Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you.
for everyone's contributions. It was wonderful. All right.